A poor mechanic pulls over to offer a soaked stranger a ride in the rain, unaware she's a billionaire running from a life of lies and looking for the one thing her money could never buy. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain came down like it had something to prove, thick, relentless, loud enough to drown out the low hum of Caleb Reed's old pickup as it wound down the back roads of Maplewood. His wipers struggled against the storm, smearing more than they cleared, and the heater wheezed warm air through tired vents. He leaned forward, squinting past the rivulets racing across the windshield, just wanting to get home, kick off his boots, and microwave whatever leftovers hadn't expired in the fridge. The day had been long. One oil change turned transmission job had eaten up most of his afternoon, and his hands still ached from torquing down bolts that didn't want to budge. Now the road stretched ahead like a soggy ribbon, empty save for the occasional mailbox and the blur of trees bent under the weight of water. Then he saw her. A figure on the shoulder, barely more than a silhouette in the rain. No umbrella. Just a coat pulled tight and a bag clutched to her chest like it held the last of something important. Her hair was slicked back by the downpour, face tilted toward the road as if hoping a car, any car, would notice. Most wouldn't. Most don't. Caleb slowed before his mind even caught up. His tires hissed as he pulled to the edge, parking just a few feet in front of her. For a moment, she didn't move. Then cautiously, she stepped toward the truck, the rain turning her blouse translucent and her eyes wary. He rolled the window down halfway, water misting through. "You all right?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Car died back there," she said, voice soft but steady. "No signal. I've been walking a while." He unlocked the passenger door without another word. "You'll catch your death out here. Hop in." She studied him for a second longer, then climbed in, shivering but composed. Caleb reached over and cranked the heater. "Where are you headed?" She stared out the fogging window. "I'm not sure anymore." And just like that, Caleb knew this ride wasn't going to be as simple as getting someone from point A to point B. Some roads, he realized, were meant to change more than tires. The cab of the truck was warm, but she stayed tense, her hands folded tightly in her lap as droplets clung to her lashes. Caleb glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, careful not to seem like he was studying her. But he was, not in a judgmental way, just curious. There was something about her that didn't quite match the soaked figure who had just trudged through a rural ditch, the way she sat, the way she held herself. There was elegance tucked beneath the exhaustion. She caught him looking and offered a faint, polite smile. "Thanks for stopping." "Wasn't going to leave someone out in this mess," he said simply, eyes back on the road. "Name's Caleb." She hesitated for the briefest second. "Elise." No last name, just Elise. It didn't sound fake exactly, but it felt like she was giving him only what she had to. He didn't press. A man who works with busted engines learns not to force anything too soon. "Well, Elise," he said, easing onto the road again, "I can get you into town. Not much open this late, but there's a diner that stays running till midnight." She nodded slowly. "Town's fine." Silence followed, not awkward, just quiet. The rain softened to a steady rhythm on the roof, and Elise rubbed her hands together, trying to coax warmth back into her fingers. "You from around here?" Caleb asked. She stared ahead, then shook her head. "No, just passing through." He wanted to ask where she was going, but something in her voice made him think she didn't know herself, or didn't want to say. Either way, he respected it. Her eyes drifted to the dashboard, where a Polaroid of a young boy in muddy overalls sat tucked into the corner. She glanced at it, then at him. "Your son?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Nephew. Helps me in the garage sometimes. Thinks he knows more than me already." That earned the first real smile from her. It was small, but it softened her whole face. Caleb found himself wishing he could hold on to it a little longer. The lights of Maplewood flickered into view through the rain, but neither of them said anything. Some moments don't need words. The road stretched ahead in slick gray lines, wipers swishing a tired rhythm as Caleb kept one hand steady on the wheel. Maplewood was still a few miles out, and the rain had softened into a mist, though it still clung to the air like a memory that refused to dry. Inside the cab it was quiet, not uncomfortable, just still. The kind of silence that had a weight to it, like something was being held in, unspoken but present. Elise sat with her arms wrapped loosely around herself, not shivering anymore, but not relaxed either. Her gaze flicked from the window to the dashboard, then back to the window again, as if looking too long at one thing might reveal something she wasn't ready to confront. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just drove, letting the heater hum and the road roll beneath them. But every now and then his eyes wandered, briefly, to her reflection in the glass. There was something about her that pulled at the part of him that noticed things most people missed. The way she kept checking her bag, not out of fear, but like it held something fragile. The way she stared at the passing trees, not watching them, but somewhere far behind them, and that name, Elise. It suited her, soft on the outside, but hiding a steel edge underneath. She finally spoke, her voice cutting gently through the quiet. "You don't ask a lot of questions." Caleb offered a faint smile. "Figured if you wanted to talk, you would." Elise glanced at him, eyes sharp for a moment, measuring. Then she nodded slowly, almost like she approved of his answer. Another pause. Then she added, "Most people want to know everything right away." "Not my style," Caleb said, easing the truck over a small pothole. "I fix things. That's the part I'm good at." She looked at him again, really looked this time, and though she didn't say anything more, her posture shifted just a little. Less guarded, less ready to bolt. Outside the mist grew lighter. Inside the silence deepened, but it wasn't the same. It had changed. It felt less like a wall and more like a waiting room. Something was coming. Neither of them knew what, but both of them, in their own quiet way, were bracing for it. They passed the old Maplewood sign just as the rain began to thin into a fine drizzle, the kind that made the road shine like polished coal. Street lights flickered to life one by one, casting golden puddles of light on the wet pavement. Caleb adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and glanced at Elise. "Where am I taking you?" She sat up a little straighter, eyes scanning the unfamiliar town. "Turn left at the next light," she said quietly. He nodded and made the turn, navigating through quiet neighborhoods and sleepy storefronts, most already closed for the night. She gave a few more directions, right at the laundromat, straight past the old church, then another, left down a narrow street that looked more like an alley. But when they reached the end of it, all that greeted them was a chain-link fence and an overgrown field, dark and silent, under the cloudy sky. Caleb put the truck in park, frowning as he looked around. "You sure this is it?" Elise didn't answer right away. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Then she exhaled slowly and said, "No, I just made that up." He didn't respond immediately, letting the moment breathe. Finally, she turned toward him, eyes tired and vulnerable, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "I didn't know what to say. I don't have a place to stay. I've been living out of hotels for a few weeks, but I left the last one without checking out. Just left." Caleb didn't ask why. He didn't ask what she was running from. He didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he said, "All right." She blinked. "All right?" He shrugged, turning the truck around slowly. "You're welcome to crash at my place for the night. Couch is not much, but it's dry and warmer than your car, I'd bet." Elise looked at him, searching for some hidden motive, some catch in the offer, but there was nothing there except worn-down decency and a man who didn't flinch when someone needed help. "Thank you," she said softly. He just nodded and turned back toward the heart of town, headlights cutting a new path through the drizzle. The rain had nearly stopped by the time they pulled into Caleb's gravel driveway. The house was small, the kind that looked like it had been patched up more times than it had been painted. The porch light flickered once before holding steady, casting a warm yellow glow over the worn steps. A stray dog barked somewhere in the distance, and the world felt wrapped in damp quiet. Caleb climbed out, grabbed a folded tarp from the back of the truck, and held it over Elise as she followed him to the door. It was a small gesture, clumsy even, but kind, thoughtful in a way that felt rare. Inside, the place smelled like old wood, engine grease, and something faintly sweet. Coffee, maybe. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't even particularly neat, but it felt lived in, like someone had tried their best to make it feel like home with whatever tools they had on hand. Caleb kicked off his boots and motioned toward the faded couch in the living room. It folds out, but the springs complain. Still, it's better than a hotel parking lot. Elise didn't sit right away. She stood in the center of the room looking around. A small stack of mail sat unopened on a crooked table. A baseball cap hung from a nail on the wall. An old photo of a little boy with messy hair and a gap-toothed smile peeked out from a dusty frame near the TV. "You sure this is okay?" she asked, her voice soft, almost uncertain. He shrugged as he moved toward the hallway. "You need a roof. I got one. Doesn't seem that complicated to me." Elise finally sat, lowering herself onto the couch with a quiet sigh. She hadn't realized how tired she was until her body sank into the cushions. For a moment, she just sat there, soaking in the stillness. Caleb returned with a folded blanket and a pillow, dropping them beside her without ceremony. "If you get hungry, kitchen's through there. Help yourself." She nodded, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you." Caleb met her eyes. "You're safe here." And somehow she believed him. Not because he said it, but because the silence in the room didn't ask her to prove anything. It just let her be. The hum of the kettle filled the silence, mingling with the soft rattle of rain against the window panes. Caleb moved around the small kitchen with the ease of someone who didn't mind doing things the hard way as long as they were done right. He ladled soup from a pot that looked older than the house itself, steam curling up in gentle spirals as he poured it into two mismatched bowls. Elise sat at the kitchen table, legs curled beneath her, watching him. She didn't mean to stare, but there was something quietly hypnotic about the way he moved. No rush, no need to impress, just steady hands, thoughtful motions, like this wasn't the first time he'd made dinner for someone who hadn't asked for it. "Hope you like lentils," he said, placing a bowl in front of her with a spoon and a folded paper towel standing in for a napkin. "Didn't have much else in the fridge." "It smells amazing," she said honestly. He gave her a half smile and sat across from her, blowing on his spoon before taking a bite. She tasted hers and paused. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm, full of flavor, and comforting in a way that caught her off guard. She couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her. Not a chef, not a staff member, a person. They ate in silence for a while, the sound of rain and the occasional clink of silverware filling the space between them. Elise took a slow sip of soup, then spoke. "You always like this?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Kind, uncomplicated, generous." He shrugged, eyes still on his bowl. "Don't think about it much. I just do what feels right." She studied him a moment longer. Most people don't do what feels right. They do what gets them something. He didn't respond right away. Then he said, "Maybe they've never had to fix a car in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. for someone who's counting on it to get their kid to school." That quieted her. For the first time in days, Elise didn't feel like she was being hunted, or judged, or measured. She felt safe, and oddly seen. In a stranger's kitchen, with lentil soup and a mechanic who asked for nothing, she let her guard down, just enough to breathe. Morning came gently, with pale light filtering through the thin curtains and the scent of strong coffee drifting from the kitchen. Elise stirred on the couch, the blanket still tucked around her shoulders, and blinked herself into the day. For a moment she forgot where she was. The quiet, the worn ceiling fan spinning lazily above, the smell of motor oil beneath the coffee. And then it came back. Caleb, the rain, the ride, the couch. She sat up slowly, brushing her fingers through her hair, still slightly damp from the night before. Across the room, Caleb stood by the counter, sipping from a chipped mug and tying his work boots. He looked the same as last night, simple flannel shirt, jeans that had seen better years, and a tiredness in his eyes that didn't come from sleep. "You're up early," he said without turning around. "I didn't sleep much," she replied, stretching lightly. "This couch has opinions." He chuckled. "Told you those springs were temperamental." She stood, folding the blanket and setting it neatly on the armrest. "Let me help with something. Dishes, laundry, anything. You don't have to, but—" "I know I don't," she interrupted gently, "but I want to." Caleb finally looked at her. There was something in her tone, soft but steady. She wasn't offering out of guilt or obligation. It was something else. Like maybe doing a small thing would make her feel a little more human again. He set his mug down. "There's a dish rack beside the sink. Knock yourself out. Just don't cut yourself on the one pan with the broken handle." Elise gave him a mock salute. "Noted." He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. "I'll be down at the garage most of the day. You've got the place to yourself if you want to rest." She nodded. "Thanks, Caleb, really." He paused at the door. "Soup and a dry place to sleep isn't much, but you looked like you needed it." "I did?" He held her gaze for a beat, then stepped out into the morning light, the door clicking softly behind him. Elise turned toward the sink, sleeves rolled up, hands steady. She wasn't used to doing ordinary things, but maybe that's what made it feel so unexpectedly good. By noon, the town of Maplewood already knew. Not everything, of course, just enough to stir the dust. Caleb Reed had brought home a woman, young, pretty, unfamiliar, and that was plenty. In a town where nothing much changed except the flavor of the week's church potluck, a new face sparked more buzz than a 4th of July parade. At the diner, Mrs. Langley leaned across the counter, whispering to Earl, who'd barely touched his pie. At the feed store, two old-timers argued over whether she was a cousin from out of state or someone Caleb was finally sweet on. Even the high school secretary on her lunch break at the bakery swore she saw her walking past the post office, looking like she stepped out of one of those fashion magazines, but with eyes that didn't quite belong. Elise noticed the stares. They weren't hostile, just curious, the way small towns often are. People weren't used to mystery here. Everyone knew everything, or at least acted like they did. So a woman with no last name and a quiet disposition made for irresistible speculation. Still, she moved through the town slowly, her pace deliberate, almost meditative. She wandered down Maple Street, stopping to look at the handmade quilts in a shop window, then ducked into the bookstore that smelled like cedar and cinnamon. She bought nothing, but she lingered, her fingers grazing spines like they were memories. At the edge of town, she found a walking trail that led into a patch of woods. She didn't go far, just enough to be swallowed by the hush of trees and the crunch of gravel beneath her borrowed boots. Her coat hung loosely on her shoulders, and for the first time in days, she breathed without looking over it. When she returned to the house, she found the dishes she'd cleaned earlier had been put away, and a note sat on the counter in Caleb's messy handwriting. "Garage is quiet today. Holler if you need anything. Caleb." She smiled. It was simple, honest, and more than enough. Let the town whisper, she thought. Let them wonder. For now she was just Elise, and this place, for all its questions, was starting to feel strangely like somewhere she didn't want to leave. The next morning, Elise showed up at the garage just after 9, hair tied back, sleeves rolled, and 2 paper cups of coffee in hand. Caleb looked up from under the hood of a '97 Ford and blinked against the sun. She handed him one without a word, and he took it, nodding his thanks. He hadn't expected her to come, Most people didn't find beauty in a place that smelled like grease and rust, but she walked around like the scent reminded her of something lost. Not repulsed, intrigued. "I thought I'd see what it is you actually do all day," she said with a small smile. He smirked. "Mostly just argue with old engines and pray for parts to show up on time." She wandered past the open bay doors, taking it all in, the scattered tools, the ancient radio playing something crackly and bluegrass, the dog-eared calendar with grease-streaked corners. Then her eyes landed on a truck in the back corner, covered in a light coat of dust, half restored, but still noble in shape. "What's that one's story?" she asked. Caleb wiped his hands and walked over, looking at it like you'd look at an old friend who owed you a good laugh. "That's Margaret's truck. Belonged to her husband. She's about 80, maybe 85 now. Said if I could get it running, she'd bake me a pie a week for the rest of my life. I told her that was too much, so we settled on 2 pies a month." Elise grinned. "And?" "And I've been working on it when I get the time. Parts are old, slow to come in, but I'll get her running." "Can I sit in it?" she asked. He raised a brow, surprised, but nodded. "Door sticks a little. Gotta lean your shoulder into it." She did, and slid into the worn bench seat. The upholstery was torn in places, the steering wheel smoothed by decades of hands. She ran her fingers over the dash like it was a piece of history. "It feels like it remembers something," she whispered. Caleb watched her from the open door, coffee forgotten in his hand. "Maybe it does." And in that quiet garage where broken things slowly came back to life, something new began to settle between them. Wordless, but real. The rain had taken a break, and the afternoon sunlight spilled in through the garage's open bay doors, warm and gold, painting long shadows across the concrete floor. Caleb was hunched over the old truck again, tinkering with a stubborn belt that didn't want to stay in place. Elise sat nearby on a turned-over milk crate, sipping water from a mason jar and absently watching the dust particles swirl in the light. It had become their routine, her showing up mid-morning, helping where she could, mostly just watching. But something about the silence between them had begun to shift. It wasn't just quiet now, it was comfortable. She set the jar down, her voice soft. "I wasn't lying when I said I didn't have a place to stay." Caleb didn't look up. "Didn't think you were." "I've been traveling for weeks," she said, fingers laced together in her lap. "Not for work, not for vacation, just moving, motel to motel, back roads, places like this." He tightened a bolt, glanced toward her. "Running?" She shook her head slowly. "Disappearing. There's a difference." He returned to his work but didn't push. That was the thing about Caleb. He had a way of holding space for people without asking them to fill it. "I got tired," she said after a moment. "Tired of pretending to be someone people expected. Tired of being surrounded by noise that didn't mean anything. I wanted to find something that felt honest." Caleb leaned against the truck, wiping his hands on a rag. "Most folks don't look for honesty. They look for something shiny and easy." "I used to," she admitted, "but it never made me feel real." The air between them held her words like a fragile truth, untested but sincere. He handed her the rag, nodding toward a grease-smudged wrench. "You want honest? Try loosening that bolt without busting your knuckles." She laughed, really laughed, the sound catching her by surprise. It wasn't polished or measured, it was human. She took the wrench and scooted closer. And as they worked side by side, shoulder to shoulder, Elise realized something unexpected. She hadn't said much, but it was more than she'd told anyone in a long, long time. The first clap of thunder cracked so loud it shook the socket tray on the workbench. Caleb looked up from the engine bay, his expression tightening. That was close. Before Elise could respond, the wind howled through the open bay doors, carrying with it a wall of rain that slammed into the garage like a freight train. Within seconds, the dusty afternoon transformed into chaos. The tin roof rattled, the lights flickered, and water began streaming through an old crack near the ceiling, right over the shelf, with the boxed carburetors. "Damn it," Caleb muttered, already moving. "Grab that tarp." Elise sprang to her feet, heart racing as adrenaline kicked in. The tarp was folded behind the tool cabinet. She yanked it free and rushed to his side, boots slipping slightly on the slick floor as the rain pounded harder. Together they threw the tarp over the shelf, water still pouring down like the building itself had sprung a leak in protest. "Buckets, there." Caleb pointed, and Elise darted across the garage, grabbing anything that could hold water. Oil pans, empty paint buckets, a cracked cooler. They worked in tandem, instinctively covering what mattered, letting the rest go. Caleb shoved the truck further back under the dry part of the roof while Elise pulled down a hanging extension cord before it could spark. The storm roared louder, and the wind whistled through the cracks like it had stories to tell. Then the power cut out completely. Darkness dropped like a curtain. For a second they stood there, breathless, soaked, silent. Then Elise laughed, a full, open laugh that echoed through the storm like defiance. "This place is trying to drown us." Caleb joined in, head tilted back, hands on his hips. "It's never boring, I'll give it that." Rain dripped from his hair. Her shirt clung to her shoulders. The floor was a mess. Tools scattered, the roof still leaking. But somehow, in the middle of it all, it felt less like disaster and more like life. Raw, unpredictable, unpolished. "Storms don't ask permission," Caleb said, handing her a dry rag. "No," Elise replied, squeezing water from her ponytail. "But sometimes they wash away what needs to go." The storm passed by mourning, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and oil. Sunlight crept back over Maplewood, glinting off puddles and broken clouds. At the garage, everything was damp but still standing. Caleb opened early, like always, sweeping out the water-tracked dust and resetting tools back to where they belonged. By 10, the day had returned to its usual rhythm. A rattling sedan came in for brake work. Old Joe stopped by just to talk about a rattle he'd probably invented, and then a man in a suit, an unfamiliar sight around here, pulled up in a rental car and asked for a quick tire patch. The guy didn't say much, just handed over his keys and sank into one of the chairs in the small waiting area, flipping absently through the magazines on the table. After a few minutes, he set one down, stood, and left without a word. Something about him had Caleb uneasy, but he shook it off. Probably just another traveler lost in a town too slow for his taste. Later, as Caleb wiped his hands and leaned against the counter to catch his breath, his eyes fell on the magazine the man had left behind. It wasn't one he recognized. Sleek cover, glossy print, the kind people in suits usually read. Out of idle curiosity, he picked it up and flipped it open, and there she was, Elise, on the cover. Different somehow. Perfect hair, sharp heels, a power stance in front of a black luxury car. The headline screamed beneath her image, Elise Hartwell, the heiress who could rewrite the future of Hartwell Industries. His breath caught. He stared at the page like it might blink away. Hartwell. He'd heard the name. Everyone had. One of the biggest corporate giants in the country, industrial, tech, transport. Billion-dollar headlines and scandal-drenched rumors. And this woman, this quiet, barefoot-in-his-kitchen woman, was at the center of it? He set the magazine down, heart thudding in his chest. Not in anger, not in fear, but something colder, something slower. He thought of her laughter in the storm, her fingers on that old truck's dashboard, her voice when she said she had nowhere to go. She wasn't just running, she was hiding, and he was beginning to understand just how far she'd gone to disappear. She found him out back, near the old woodpile, stacking damp logs to dry in the weak sun. The storm had left the yard muddy and heavy, but Caleb moved with his usual quiet focus, each piece of firewood landing with a thud that echoed more than it should have. Elise hesitated at the edge of the porch, heart thudding in her chest. She hadn't meant to keep it from him. Not like this. But how do you tell someone you're not who you pretended to be when for the first time in your life Pretending felt like freedom? He didn't look up when she stepped closer. "You saw it," she said. A long pause. "Yeah," he replied, his voice calm. Too calm. "Magazine on the counter. Must have missed that part when you introduced yourself." She winced. "It's not what you think." Caleb finally turned to her, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Then help me think something else." She nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. "My full name is Elise Hartwell. My family owns Hartwell Industries. My father is everything I didn't want to become." Caleb didn't speak. He waited. "I left because I couldn't take it anymore. The expectations, the headlines, the deals made in rooms full of people who never asked what I wanted. They don't see me. They see a tool, a name, a legacy to shape, and I got tired of being shaped." She stepped into the mud without noticing, without caring. "I wasn't planning to land here. I didn't even know this town existed. But when you stopped in that storm, when you didn't ask for anything, it felt like the first real thing I've touched in years." Caleb looked at her for a long time, eyes unreadable. Then finally he spoke, softly. "You lied." "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "But you did." She didn't argue, just stood there in the silence of her confession, the storm now inside her instead of outside. Caleb turned back to the woodpile. "You running away from them, or running toward something else?" She blinked back tears. "I don't know yet, but I know I don't want to go back." And for now, that was the truest thing she could offer. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. Not really. Caleb finished stacking the wood and went back to the garage. Elise cleaned the dishes she hadn't dirtied just to keep her hands busy. They moved like planets, close, orbiting, but not colliding. The truth hung in the air between them, too fresh to touch, too big to ignore. That night, she sat on the porch steps while the sun melted behind the trees, turning the sky a soft orange. The air smelled like wet earth and engine oil. And for the first time in days, Elise felt cold, not from the weather, but from the fear that maybe, just maybe, she'd ruined the only real thing she'd found. Caleb stepped out just as the last light dipped beneath the horizon. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed ahead. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "My father had my whole life mapped out before I could spell my name." He stayed quiet. "Private schools, internships at 15, galas, photo ops. I didn't earn anything. I was just handed pieces of a future I never asked for." Her voice tightened. "I wasn't allowed to fail or feel or breathe." Caleb let the silence stretch, like he was giving her permission to take her time. "I dated who I was told to date. Got engaged once to a man my father picked. We smiled for cameras. He was polished, successful, charming, and so empty it scared me." She laughed bitterly. "When I told my father I was leaving him, he said, 'You're not thinking clearly. You'll thank me later.'" "And did you?" Caleb asked. "No," she said. "I packed a bag and disappeared. No press release, no farewell tour, just silence." He glanced over. "And the money?" She shook her head. "Left it behind. If I had it, I knew I'd use it. To fix, to avoid, to stay numb." Caleb exhaled, long and low. "That's a heavy kind of freedom." She turned to him then, her face in the glow of the porch light. "I wasn't looking for rescue, Caleb. I just wanted something real, something that doesn't come with a price tag or a headline." He didn't promise her anything, didn't offer comfort he wasn't sure she wanted, but he nodded once, slow and sure, and that small gesture felt like the first brick in something worth building. Caleb lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. The clock ticked from 1 hour to the next, steady and indifferent, while his thoughts moved like gravel under a tire, rough, unpredictable, loud in the dark. Elise Hartwell, billionaire, heiress. A name that didn't belong in this house, in this town, in his life. He pictured the magazine cover again, her face, polished and confident, staring out at the world like it owed her nothing. But that wasn't the woman who had laughed beside him in the storm. That wasn't the girl who had folded his laundry without being asked or offered to scrub grease out of his sink. He turned over, staring at the ceiling. Part of him felt foolish. She hadn't lied outright, but she hadn't told him the truth either. And he wasn't a man who liked being left in the dark. But another part, quieter, harder to silence, remembered the way her hands had trembled when she told her story, how her voice cracked when she said she left everything behind. That part of him didn't see Hartwell Industries. It saw a woman running barefoot through the fire of her own life, just trying to find cool ground. By morning, the anger had dulled to something heavier. Not rage, not resentment, just the weight of knowing too much and not enough at the same time. At the garage, he went through the motions, oil changes, tire rotations, but the radio felt too loud, and the socket wrench too sharp in his grip. Every time he wiped his hands on his jeans, he saw her, sitting on that crate, cradling a mason jar like it held more than just water. When he came home that evening, she was out on the porch again, legs curled beneath her, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts. She didn't speak when he walked up, didn't make excuses, just looked up at him like she knew he'd been carrying a question all day. "I don't know what to do with all this," he admitted quietly. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "I'm still the girl who liked your soup." And somehow, that mattered more than anything her last name could buy. The old garage sign had been hanging above the bay doors since Caleb was a teenager, hand-painted by his uncle sometime in the 80s, the letters faded, chipped, and clinging to the wood like they were too stubborn to let go. Elise stood beside him now, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a paintbrush in one hand and a smudge of blue across her cheek. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, eyeing the wobbly stencil Caleb had taped down. He grinned, holding up a can of paint like a toast. "If we mess it up, we'll just call it character." The ladder wobbled slightly under her feet as she leaned in, carefully brushing the first stroke across the letter R. Caleb stood just below, steadying the base, offering commentary that was more teasing than helpful. "I feel like I'm vandalizing something sacred," she said. "Nah, you're resurrecting it," he replied. This place needed a facelift anyway. By the time they finished, the sun had dipped behind the water tower, casting golden light across the fresh paint. The letters were crooked. A few lines bled outside the stencil. Her hands were a mess of smudges and splatters, but it looked alive, like something someone loved. They stepped back together to admire it. "Harrison and Reed Auto," Elise read aloud. "You kept your uncle's name. He taught me everything. Figured I owed him more than a memory." She glanced sideways at him. "You're loyal, even when no one's looking." He shrugged, but the compliment softened something in his posture. "People like us. We fix what we can, and sometimes we hold on to what's already broken just to prove it still matters." Elise didn't respond. She just leaned the brush against the wall, wiping her palms on a rag, the smile on her face real and effortless. Later, sitting on the curb, drinking warm soda from the machine out back, they watched the sky turn 100 shades of peach and purple. Elise tilted her head against his shoulder without asking, and he didn't move. It wasn't about painting a sign. It was about painting something back into herself, something she thought she'd lost. Hope, she realized, didn't always arrive polished. Sometimes it showed up covered in blue smudges and the scent of motor oil. The diner sat on the corner of Main and Birch, with cracked vinyl booths and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed in years. Locals called it Lou's, even though Lou had passed a decade ago, and his daughter, Marianne, ran the place now. The scent of bacon, brewed coffee, and maple syrup lingered in the air like a promise that whatever was broken could wait till after breakfast. Caleb and Elise took a booth by the window, sunlight pouring in and casting soft halos around their plates. He ordered the usual, 3 pancakes, 2 eggs, black coffee. She hesitated, then mimicked him, minus the eggs. Her hands curled around the chipped mug, steam rising into the soft morning light. "You always eat here?" she asked, eyes scanning the room filled with familiar faces. "Most mornings, he replied. "Keeps the fridge at home honest." Elise smiled. "It's nice. It feels lived in." He smirked. "It's not trying to impress anyone." "Neither are you," she said softly. Caleb looked up at her then, really looked. She wasn't the Elise from the magazine cover. She was the woman who helped repaint a sign, laughed when her brush dripped all over her shoes, and still had blue paint under one fingernail. Something about that mattered more than a perfect past ever could. "So," he said, buttering his pancakes, "what happens next?" She stirred her coffee, thoughtful. "I don't know. I could go back. There'd be contracts, cameras, and a parade of people who want to shape me into whatever fits the next headline. But I'm tired of fitting. I want to build something that doesn't collapse when no one's watching." Caleb nodded slowly. "I get that. I've been building this life bolt by bolt, but most days I'm just barely keeping the wheels on." She laughed, the kind of laugh that starts low in the chest and climbs. "So we're both rebuilding, just at different speeds." "Sounds like it." They finished their breakfast in a silence that felt full rather than empty. For the first time in a long while, Elise didn't feel like she was running, and Caleb didn't feel quite so alone at the table. The sky was deepening into twilight, the kind of blue that only comes after a long, quiet day. Crickets had begun their nightly chorus, and somewhere down the road a screen door creaked shut. Caleb and Elise sat on the porch steps, plates cleaned from dinner, glasses still sweating faintly beside them. The smell of grilled corn and herbs clung to the air, mingling with the faint scent of sawdust from a project he'd abandoned earlier. Neither of them said much, but it wasn't the kind of silence that demanded to be broken. It was the kind that let you sit inside it without needing to explain why you stayed. Elise had changed into one of Caleb's old hoodies, sleeves pushed up, her legs tucked under her. She looked smaller somehow, but not fragile, just real, present, the way a person looks when they finally stop holding their breath. Her hand rested on the porch plank beside his, fingers close enough that he could feel their warmth. When the back of her hand brushed his, it was barely a touch, but it sent a ripple through the quiet that neither of them could ignore. He looked over, eyes searching hers in the fading light. There was no mask, no trace of the billion-dollar name, just Elise, just this moment. She didn't pull away, she didn't lean in either, but her eyes didn't leave his. Caleb leaned closer, slow enough that it didn't feel like movement, more like gravity, like something invisible had shifted between them, tilting the world by a few careful degrees. But just before their lips met, he paused, not out of doubt, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, respect, the kind that knew her story wasn't finished, and his had been too quiet for too long. He pulled back barely an inch and looked away. Elise exhaled softly, not in disappointment but understanding. Her hand stayed near his. Some things didn't need to be rushed. Some things were worth getting right, even if it meant waiting one more night. The hum of the garage radio played faintly in the background, old country drifting out through static as Caleb wiped oil from his hands and leaned into the open hood of a stubborn Buick. The morning had been quiet, predictable. Elise had brought him coffee again, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, her smile soft but distant. He could tell something was stirring behind her eyes. She hadn't said much, and he hadn't asked. Just after 11, the sound of tires crunching over gravel made him look up. A black car, sleek, foreign, wrong for Maplewood, rolled to a stop outside the garage. Its windows were tinted too dark, and its shine didn't belong next to rusted tailpipes and patched tires. The doors opened like they were used to being obeyed. Out stepped a man in a tailored gray suit, sharp as a scalpel and twice as cold. He looked around once, then walked toward the open bay like he owned it. "Elise Hartwell," he said, not a greeting but a summons. Caleb's posture shifted. He stood straighter, eyes narrowing. "And you are?" The man didn't offer a name, just reached into his coat and pulled out a card, placing it deliberately on the workbench. "Hartwell Industries, Executive Liaison. I'm here on behalf of her father. He's been deeply concerned." "She's not property," Caleb said evenly. "She's not required to report in." Elise stepped out from behind the office door. Her face was calm, but her hands curled tightly at her sides. "Hello, Daniel." "Miss Hartwell." The man nodded stiffly. "I'm under strict instruction to escort you home. Your absence has created unnecessary speculation." "I'm aware," she said quietly, "but I'm not ready to return." Daniel's jaw flexed. "This situation has gone on long enough. The company is vulnerable. Your father insists." She looked at Caleb for a moment, her gaze steady. "Tell him I'm not a pawn. Tell him I'll return when I decide, not when he sends a chauffeur." Daniel stepped closer. "Elise, be reasonable." "I am," she replied, voice like iron wrapped in silk. The man hesitated, then, with a slight nod, turned and walked back to the car. The engine purred to life and disappeared down the road like a shadow pulled too tight. Caleb exhaled slowly. "So that's what knocking looks like where you're from." She gave him a weary smile. "That wasn't a knock. That was a warning." The garage was quiet after Daniel left, too quiet. Even the old radio seemed unsure whether it should keep playing, crackling softly in the background, like it didn't want to interrupt whatever was unfolding. Elise sat on the workbench, legs swinging slightly, her arms wrapped around herself. Caleb stood a few feet away, wiping his hands with the same rag he always used when he didn't know what to say. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but she could feel the weight of his thoughts. Finally, she broke the silence. "The company's in trouble. I knew it might be, but I didn't think it would unravel this fast." Caleb glanced over. "Because you left?" She nodded. "There were deals on the table, people who only stayed because they thought I'd step up. When I vanished, they did too. So now they want the face back," he said. "Doesn't matter if the heart behind it's still bruised." She smiled weakly. "You have a way with words." "I've been under enough broken hoods to know a busted part when I see one." She hopped off the bench, pacing the garage floor, eyes darting between the shadows of engine bays and oil stains. "My father doesn't want me back because he misses me. He wants control, damage control, headlines, shareholders." "And what do you want?" Caleb asked, his voice quieter now. She stopped, turned to face him. "I want to stay, here, with you. I want slow mornings and crooked signs and nights on the porch that don't need anything more than silence." He held her gaze, steady and unreadable. "But I'm being pulled back," she added softer, "by guilt, obligation, the voice in my head that says I'm being selfish to want this." Caleb stepped forward. "Maybe it's not selfish to want peace. Maybe it's finally honest." She swallowed hard. "What if going back ruins me? And what if staying saves you?" he said. The words hung between them, heavier than any storm that had passed. She didn't answer, not yet. But her eyes said everything. She was standing on the edge of two lives, and one of them felt a lot more like home. The garage was quieter than usual the next morning. Caleb unlocked the side door just after dawn, like he always did, but something felt off. The air was heavier. The echo of his boots against the concrete sounded louder than it should. He flipped the lights on, one by one, the old fluorescents humming to life with their usual flicker and hum. He walked past the workbench to grab his tools, but stopped short. There, resting neatly beside his wrench set, was something that didn't belong. A watch, sleek, expensive, too polished for a place like this. Its silver band caught the light, gleaming in contrast to the grease-stained wood beneath it. He stared at it for a moment, confused. Then he reached out, turning it slowly in his palm. It was Elise's. He remembered her wearing it once, briefly, when she first arrived. After that, he hadn't seen it again. She never flaunted anything, didn't need to. She had blended into this town like she was made for it, not like someone hiding from it. But this watch, it was her world before all this. Cold boardrooms, clocked minutes, polished smiles. And now it was sitting here, alone, deliberately placed, not forgotten. Caleb's chest tightened as the realization hit. She hadn't just left it. She'd left it for him. Like a message she didn't know how to speak aloud, like a piece of herself she didn't want to carry anymore. He set the watch down carefully, next to the same wrench she'd fumbled with when she tried to loosen a bolt without busting her knuckles. It felt like a symbol now, tools of two lives, laid side by side. He looked around the garage, suddenly aware of the quiet in a way he hadn't been before. Her absence wasn't just a missing voice, it was a missing presence. A light gone out, but still flickering in memory. She'd left something behind. And whether she was gone for an hour or a lifetime, she'd left a part of her story here, in his world, on his bench. And that, somehow, made all the difference. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops when Caleb pulled the garage door open, the metal groaning like it, too, had something heavy on its chest. He moved through the motions, turning on the lights, organizing tools, checking his clipboard, but it all felt mechanical, like watching someone else wear his body. By mid-morning, he was under the hood of an old Dodge when he heard the sound of sneakers scuffing across gravel. He looked up to see a familiar face. Emily Cartwright, 7 years old, gap-toothed and fearless, standing by the garage entrance with a juice box in one hand and curiosity in the other. She waved. "Hi, Mr. Reed." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, smiling faintly. "Hey there, Em. Skipping school?" "Nah," she said, stepping closer. "Mom's inside the bakery and said I could say hi while we wait for our muffins." Caleb crouched beside the truck, trying to act casual, but something about her timing made his stomach shift. Emily looked around. "Is the pretty lady here today?" He froze for just a beat. "Which lady?" "The one with the ponytail. She helped you paint the sign, right?" Her eyes sparkled like she'd just solved a mystery. "I liked her. She didn't talk to me like a kid. She said my shoes were cool." Caleb smiled despite the ache in his chest. "Yeah, she's something." Emily tilted her head. "Is she coming back?" He didn't answer right away. There it was. The question. The one he'd been asking himself since he found the watch on the bench. He wanted to say yes, wanted to say she just needed air or time or space. But the truth was, he didn't know. So he knelt in front of Emily and offered the only honest thing he could. "I hope so." Emily studied him for a second, then nodded, like that was good enough. "Okay, tell her I said hi if she does." Then she turned and skipped off, leaving him standing there, holding a wrench in one hand and an emptiness in the other. Hope, he realized, was sometimes just the space between questions and answers. The diner was quieter than usual that afternoon. Caleb sat in his usual booth, second from the window, nursing a coffee that had gone cold half an hour ago. He hadn't touched his sandwich. The waitress had offered to warm it once, then stopped asking. The rain had returned, not a storm this time, just a steady, soaking drizzle that turned the sidewalks into glistening veins of silver. Outside, people moved slowly, hunched beneath umbrellas, waiting for weather and time to pass. Inside, the old TV mounted in the corner crackled as it shifted between segments. Caleb wasn't paying much attention until he heard her name. Elise Hartwell, daughter of business mogul Nathaniel Hartwell, has reportedly gone missing, the anchor announced, voice smooth and urgent. Sources close to the Hartwell family confirm that Elise has not been seen in over 3 weeks. The heiress was expected to take over as acting CEO following her father's recent health complications. Her disappearance has raised concerns both inside the company and across global financial markets. Caleb looked up slowly, as if drawn by instinct. There she was. Her face filled the screen, polished, pristine, posed for a corporate headshot, hair pulled back into a perfect knot, a dark blazer with sharp shoulders, eyes looking just past the camera, not quite meeting anyone's gaze. He barely recognized her. This Elise was distant, sculpted, silent behind the armor of a brand. It wasn't the woman who painted signs barefoot or laughed at his pancake jokes. It wasn't the girl who whispered truths on his porch with the moonlight in her hair. The anchor continued. Hartwell Industries has declined to comment beyond a brief statement expressing concern for her well-being and asking for privacy. Rumors of a family rift continue to circulate, though no confirmation has been given. The screen shifted to a photo of her walking into a gala, paparazzi bulbs bursting around her like fireworks. Caleb stared, heart heavy. The woman in the footage didn't look lost. She looked erased. He pushed the plate away and left a few bills on the table, stepping out into the drizzle without his jacket. She hadn't just disappeared from that world. She'd been trying to disappear from herself, and now the world was trying to find her, but only the version it had built. The house was too quiet. Caleb stepped through the front door, the rain still dripping from his jacket, boots tracking faint mud across the entryway. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The gray afternoon poured through the windows in pale sheets, casting everything in soft shadow. It was the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound louder, every breath feel like a question. The couch sat just as he'd left it that morning, blanket folded neatly over the armrest, the pillow untouched. No indentation, no forgotten sock, just empty. He stood there for a long moment, hand resting on the back cushion, as if it might still be warm from where she used to sit. Across the room, her tea mug still sat on the table, a thin line of untouched chamomile resting cold at the bottom. He hadn't moved it, couldn't bring himself to. It felt like if he picked it up, she'd be gone for real. And some foolish part of him still believed she might walk through the door at any minute, wind in her hair, rain on her sleeves, eyes tired but sure. But she didn't. The flannel shirt she'd borrowed was still hanging over the chair. He brushed his fingers against it absent-mindedly, half hoping he'd feel her there. What he felt instead was the absence, a hollow space where her presence used to settle like a breath in the air. The house hadn't changed, but everything inside it had. He walked into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and saw the box of herbal tea she'd bought on a whim at the corner store. The one she said tasted like warm grass, but in a good way. It sat unopened, waiting. He closed the cabinet. Even her silence had a shape, a scent, a ghost of comfort still living in the walls, and she hadn't taken much when she left. But what she left behind filled every empty corner of the room. The rain had eased into a soft mist by the time Caleb reached the truck. The sun was sinking low, streaking the sky with gold and ash, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. He opened the driver's side door out of habit, not intention, just needing to be near something she'd touched, something that hadn't disappeared. The truck still smelled faintly of her shampoo, like citrus and lavender, clinging stubbornly to the old seat fabric. He sat down slowly, hands resting on the wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing. That's when he noticed it. The glove box, slightly ajar, just enough to catch the light. He opened it. Inside was a stack of envelopes, cream-colored, neat handwriting and black ink. Not sealed, not mailed, just resting there like a collection of unfinished goodbyes. He hesitated, then pulled them out gently. The first few were addressed vaguely, no names, just titles. To the girl I used to be, to the world I thought I wanted, to my father, when he finally listens. And then the last one, shorter, simpler, Caleb. His name in her hand. He held it for a moment, thumb tracing the edge. There was no question of reading it. He needed to, the way a man needs to breathe after holding his sorrow under water for too long. Inside, the letter was small, just a few lines, but they landed like thunder. I don't know how to thank you without making it sound like a debt. And I don't want this to feel like one. You gave me something no one ever has. You saw me before I said a word. You made space for me without asking for anything in return. I don't know what comes next, but I know that if I had met you first, in a different life, on a different road, I wouldn't have run. I would have stayed." He read it twice, 3 times, then folded it carefully, pressed it against his chest, and leaned back in the seat with his eyes closed. She may have left, but this was the part of her that had stayed. The rain had come back by midnight, soft and steady, like it was trying to wash the world clean without waking it. Caleb sat on the porch in his worn flannel, an untouched mug of coffee cooling beside him, the steam long gone. The town had gone to sleep hours ago, but he couldn't. Not tonight. Not with her letter folded neatly in his pocket, close to where her voice still echoed in his chest. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed, just slow, uncertain, squishing against the wet gravel of the drive. He stood up, heart hammering in a way it hadn't in years, every part of him bracing for a hope he wasn't sure he was allowed to hold. And then she was there. Elise stood at the edge of the porch, soaked through, rain clinging to her coat, hair plastered to her cheeks. Her suitcase wasn't with her. No driver, no headlines, just her, just this. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world held its breath. "I left everything," she said, voice trembling. "The board, the title, the condo, the version of me that made sense on paper." She stepped closer, rain dripping from her sleeves. "But I couldn't leave you." Caleb's chest rose with a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for weeks. He looked at her, not as a headline or a mystery, but as the woman who painted signs and cried in the storm and wrote letters she never meant to send. "You sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "No, but I'm sure I'd rather be unsure here with you than certain anywhere else without you." He stepped forward slowly and took her hand, cold and soaked, and pulled her beneath the awning. There was no applause, no cameras, no perfect music playing in the background, just the sound of rain hitting the tin roof, and the feeling that something broken had finally come home. The next morning didn't arrive with fanfare, just soft light spilling through the windows, birdsong in the trees, and the smell of eggs cooking in the skillet. Elise stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing one of Caleb's old flannel shirts over her tea, sleeves rolled, hair still damp from her shower. She stirred the pan like it was a ritual, quiet, deliberate, calming. Caleb entered with 2 mugs of coffee and placed one beside her. "Didn't peg you for a breakfast person." "I wasn't," she said with a smile, "but I think I'm becoming one." They ate at the kitchen table, knees brushing under the wood conversation light. No questions about the future, no pressure to define what they were. Just this. 2 people sharing toast and starting over, not from scratch, but from truth. She helped him at the garage that afternoon, not like before, not just observing from the sidelines. This time she got her hands dirty. She asked questions. She stripped wire. She accidentally broke a wrench and laughed harder than she had in days. "You're dangerous with tools," Caleb teased. "I'm evolving," she replied, holding up her grease-smeared fingers like a badge of honor. He watched her wipe her hands on a towel, and for a second he felt the tightness in his chest again, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that she was really here. No secrets, no script, just Elise, and he was just Caleb. No need to prove anything, no need to fix what wasn't broken. That evening they sat on the back porch, legs dangling off the edge. The town around them settled into its usual rhythm, quiet, slow, steady. He offered her a worn notepad, the one he kept tucked in the garage for jotting down parts he needed. She flipped through the blank pages. "What's this for?" He shrugged. "Whatever you want to build next?" She looked at him, eyes shining just a little. "Maybe I'll start with this." She wrote the word home at the top of the page, and for once they didn't need to say anything more. The town hall was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner of the modest meeting room, the scent of coffee and old wood heavy in the air. Locals murmured to one another as they waited, some curious, some skeptical. Maplewood didn't do many formal votes. Most decisions were made over diner counters or across tool benches, but tonight felt different. Elise stood near the front, papers in her hand, her nerves masked beneath a calm exterior she hadn't worn in a while. She wasn't in heels or a blazer, just jeans, boots, and a navy sweater that still smelled faintly like Caleb's dryer sheets. But it wasn't what she wore that mattered. It was what she was about to offer. Caleb stood in the back, arms crossed, watching, not as a guard or a guide, but as someone who believed in what she had become. Mayor Dobbins called for quiet, and the room hushed. Elise stepped forward. "My name is Elise Monroe," she began. A different name. One that didn't come with headlines. Just hers. Chosen. "I've spent the last few months here getting to know your town, your stories, your struggles. I've seen how hard people work to keep the lights on in their shops, how many of you give more than you have because you believe in something bigger than yourselves, and I think that deserves support." She took a breath, heart steady now. "I'm proposing a community growth fund. It would provide small grants and zero-interest loans to local businesses, startups, and apprenticeships. No red tape, just real help. I've already donated the seed money anonymously. This vote is just to ask for your permission to keep it here." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Questions were asked, clarifications made, but when the final count was called, it was unanimous. Yes. Applause broke out, not wild or theatrical, but real, honest. The kind of applause that came from people who didn't clap easily. Elise caught Caleb's eye across the room. He didn't smile big, just a small nod, enough. And in that moment she realized she hadn't just found belonging, she had built it. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that only came after something important had been said and received. They sat on the back porch again side by side, wrapped in an old quilt Elise had found in the hall closet. The stars were out, clear, bold, unapologetic, and the wind carried just a hint of coming fall. Caleb had been silent for a while, hands tucked into the blanket, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. Elise didn't press. She'd learned he needed space before he gave pieces of himself away. But tonight, something in his eyes was different. Like a door he'd kept shut for years was slowly creaking open. "My dad left when I was 10, he said, voice low, like it might shatter the night if he spoke any louder. No note. No reason. Just didn't come home one day. Elise turned to him but didn't interrupt. "My mom, she did everything after that. Worked 2 jobs. Took in laundry at night. Sold our old furniture just to keep the lights on." He let out a breath. "I started fixing things because we couldn't afford to replace anything. First it was the toaster, then the truck. Eventually, I was fixing other people's stuff too. Not for money at first, just so I wouldn't feel useless." Elise placed her hand gently over his. "I guess part of me still thinks that way," he added. "Like if I'm not fixing something, I'm failing. And sometimes I look at you and all the things you walked away from, and I wonder if I'd ever be enough." Her grip tightened slightly, but he kept going. "I never wanted much, just something steady, something honest. But people like you, people with stories like yours, they don't usually stay." She shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. "But I did?" He looked down at her, his throat tight. "Why?" "Because you're not a rescue, Caleb. You're a place. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to belong somewhere that didn't expect me to be anything but who I already am." The stars didn't answer. They didn't need to. The rain returned that evening, soft at first, barely more than a whisper against the windows, then steady and sure, tapping gently on the roof like it had always been part of the rhythm of their days. But this time it didn't bring tension. It didn't feel like a warning or a goodbye. It just was. The house was warm, filled with the comforting scent of roasted vegetables and cinnamon from the pie Elise had insisted on baking, even though she'd never made one before. The crust was uneven. The filling bubbled over. Caleb had told her it was perfect, and she'd rolled her eyes and called him a liar. But she'd smiled too. They stood in the kitchen, barefoot on creaking floorboards, the overhead light casting a soft golden hue over everything. Outside, the rain tapped a quiet song, but inside, it was calm. It was enough. Caleb leaned against the counter, drying his hands. Elise stood across from him, the sleeves of her sweater pushed to her elbows, her cheeks flushed from the oven's heat, or maybe something else. "It's raining again," she said, glancing toward the window. He looked, then back at her. "Yeah, but this time, you're not out in it." She met his eyes, and the space between them felt impossibly full of all the things they hadn't needed to say, of all the things they'd come to understand. He took a step closer. Slowly. No urgency, just presence. The way you move when you're not afraid to be seen. "You still thinking of leaving?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. "I think I already stayed." And with that he closed the distance. His hand cupped her cheek, gentle, grounding. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. In the soft light of the kitchen, with the rain threading through the silence, Caleb kissed her, slow, steady, and with the kind of care that said he knew exactly what it meant. No flash, no music, just the realness of it. When they pulled apart, she leaned her forehead against his. "Took you long enough." He smiled, lips brushing hers again. "Worth the wait." The old truck coughed, sputtered, and then, finally, roared to life like it had been holding its breath for years. Caleb stepped back from the hood, grease smudged on his arms, a proud grin tugging at his mouth. Elise stood beside him, hands on her hips, eyes wide with disbelief. "You did it," she whispered, then added with a playful nudge, "Took you long enough." He smirked. Had to make sure she was ready for the right driver. Elise raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying I get to take her for a spin?" Caleb tossed her the keys. "She's all yours." Her smile stretched wide as she climbed behind the wheel, the door creaking just like he warned it would. The bench seat was patched in places, the dashboard sun-faded, but it was perfect. She slid her hands over the wheel like it was something sacred. Caleb climbed in beside her, leaning back with one boot propped on the edge. "Easy on the clutch. She's temperamental." Elise threw him a look. "Aren't we all?" The truck jerked once, then smoothed out as they pulled onto the road, the engine humming with new life. Windows down, wind whipping through her hair, she laughed. Loud, unfiltered, the sound filling the cab like music. Caleb reached over to the radio, thumping it twice before it crackled on. Static turned to old rock. Something with a beat and a soul. He turned it up, the speakers rattling just enough to make it feel real. They drove with no destination, the town blurring past, trees bending gently in the breeze. Elise shifted gears like she'd been doing it her whole life. Caleb watched her, not just the way she handled the wheel, but the way she looked doing it. Free, unburdened. Her shoulders weren't carrying the world anymore. She glanced over at him, eyes dancing. "This feels like flying." He leaned back, smiling. "That's because it is." And as the road stretched ahead and the engine hummed beneath them, it wasn't just the truck that had come back to life. It was her. It was both of them. The rain tapped gently on the farmhouse windows, a soft echo of the night. Everything changed. Elise sat curled on the couch, a blanket tucked around her legs, their daughter nestled beside her, hair the same shade as Caleb's, eyes carrying that quiet intensity that always saw more than she let on. "Tell me again," the little girl whispered, head resting against her mother's shoulder. "The story about the rain." Elise smiled, brushing a lock of damp hair from her daughter's forehead. Outside, Caleb was in the barn tuning an old engine while the dog snored near his boots. The same man, the same porch, but everything was different now. "It was years ago," Elise began, her voice soft but steady, "and I was lost. Not the kind of lost you fix with a map, the kind that lives inside you." Her daughter looked up, listening the way only children do, completely. "I was walking alone on a road I didn't know, soaked to the bone. thinking I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't go back. And then a truck pulled over, beat up, loud, probably held together with duct tape, she said, laughing quietly. And inside was your dad. He rolled down the window and said the simplest words I'd ever heard. Need a ride? The little girl's eyes widened, as they always did at this part. I didn't know it then, Elise continued, but that one moment, him pulling over, offering kindness without a single question, that moment rewrote everything. But you were rich, the girl said, brows furrowed. Why didn't you just get a driver? Elise smiled, a little sad, a little amused. Because all the money in the world couldn't buy what I found that night. I didn't need a driver. I needed someone real, someone honest. I needed your dad. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain still dancing on the roof. And that's how we got you, Elise whispered, kissing her daughter's hair. From a ride in the rain, the best wrong turn I ever made. And in the soft warmth of that room, surrounded by the life they'd built from second chances and muddy roads, the story didn't feel like a memory. It felt like home.